Well, hello there. I am Nixel, and this is my reflection time on my time in WoW. I've so far done TBC and Wrath of the Lich King, so if you want to, you can check those out. Or don't. So Deathwing awakens and the world is sundered and all that. Early leveling was revamped considerably, for better or worse. That doesn't matter now though, as it's time to level to max again. Once again, we are faced with two choices. Mount Hyjal with its elementals, or Bashir, Under the Sea, with its Naga shenanigans. I'm pretty confident that I went straight to Mount Hyjal and never touched Bashir, but most of the leveling for me is quite blurry. The clearest memory of Cataclysm leveling at the start is from Deepholm, where I was scared shitless of pulling multiple mobs as they were really herdy. And that really is it. I don't remember much of dungeons either, other than I wasn't as much ahead of the curve as much as I was in Wrath of the Lich King, so I could start farming dungeons nearly immediately. Early Cataclysm is what I would consider a shitfest for me in terms of raiding. Why? Because at the time I was doing my secondary education's mandatory work experience. That entailed a 3-shift work schedule. Morning, evening, and night on a rotation. It completely ruined me. Like, I had to skip around 80% of the raids for a month or 3 because I just couldn't handle doing both. Regardless, I do remember some parts. Early tier began with 2 raids. Well, 3 if you count the one in Oldham, but it wasn't really appealing as a raid outside of bragging rights, as the loot had random stats or something along those lines. For our first few weeks we took turns on doing the 2 raids, and it's probably why we didn't clear them that fast. Yet we did eventually, and it was time for some heroic modes. We ended up never doing 10-man with our mains like in Wrath of the Lich King, because I think we were now locked into 10-man or 25-man with one character. But we still had plans for alt raiding. In terms of 10-man, I can't for the life of me remember how much we cleared on heroic, but I know for a fact we did clear everything on normal at least, with the alts. In terms of 25-man, we progressed a lot better, with Bastion of Twilight being the one we didn't end up succeeding much in. We managed the first and the second boss only, really. Interestingly, there was a type of cheesing tactic for the second boss. I won't bore you with too many details, but let's just say a single rogue could solo a mechanic that was meant for most of the raid, which meant our raid of 0 rogues needed to use alts for it, which would end up being my rogue mainly. Cloak of Shadows is broken. Moving on to Blackwind Descent, we did 5 out of 6 of the heroic modes, which included the last boss, Nefarian, with us skipping Omnitron, probably because fuck him. It was annoying, which meant we now had a new title. At this point, I had graduated from my mandatory studies, and it began my descent into becoming a bum. I had no interest in getting a job or to continue to a higher education. All I wanted was to wake up, play video games, and go to sleep, which I acted on with vigor. It was also a descent into becoming more miserable, as I pursued ways of getting short-term happiness. It was pretty bad. Waking up at 5 PM and going to bed at 7 AM wasn't a rare occurrence. It wasn't a good time at all for me or others around me. To explain how obnoxious I was, I had 2 former friends I would play League of Legends with, but one day they messaged me that they didn't want to do that anymore, as my judging and analyzing their choices was getting out of hand. The thing is, I was completely aware of that, even going as far as to expect the situation. But I didn't temper it in any way, so I accepted their decision without any backsay. In hindsight, I have no idea what I should have done at this point in my life. Talk to a therapist? I imagine I would have faked my way through that, just to get it over with, as I didn't want to change. The depression that I felt at the time would birth some new choices later on though, and we'll go over that briefly then. More importantly, it is time for hacking Firelands, boyo! It's probably considered the crowning jewel of Cataclysm. The raid held quite a lot of significance at the time, in the sense that Ragnaros was such an iconic boss to the franchise. Yet we never really got close to killing him in the heroic mode on 10 or 25 man mode. And I think we took a conscious decision to not worry about it too hard. But we did clear everything else. In my mind though, every boss that wasn't dead was like a smudge on my non-existent CV to the people out there in WoW. I still played my Warlock in 25 mans. In 10 mans I hopped between a Druid and a Rogue, with a stronger emphasis on the Rogue later on. I was still competing for top place on DPS. I was also heavily vocal about tactics and researched them nearly every day, especially when we would wipe to a boss for a full raid. The raid also had one key aspect to it. It had the quest for a legendary staff for casters. Now, I wasn't the person to get it, which was fine. There were people who had been in the guild for way longer than I had. However, I did get the second staff. It wasn't until literally the day Dragon Soul came out, and we had to go do a few bosses to get the final fragments for it, but I got it, and I was thrilled. It was probably a moment of pride for me back then. People showing that I had value. But before we move on, I want to tell you how I single-handedly fucked our first Ragnaros normal kill. The fight has many mechanics, but let's focus on the one that matters. Meatballs. The boss throughout the phases summons these meteors, which basically chase people down and hit them for a massive amount of damage. And usually ends up killing them unless you hit the meteor and push it away, after which it begins chasing different targets. So imagine, we are at the final 10% of the boss's health. I am happily DPSing the boss. Kill seems like a sure deal now that most of the raid is alive, and we have the fight under control. Then this healer passes me with a meteor, and as they do, I hear a familiar sound as Nightfall effect procs. Nightfall of course makes my next Shadow Bolt instant. So what happens next still puzzles me to this day. I notice the buff, and I immediately target the meatball and throw the instant Shadow Bolt on it. This causes a chain reaction as the meatball gets pushed into the tanks, one-shotting both of them, after which the boss begins going through all the melee before there is no one left in melee range, and as he can't move, he begins AoEing the raid instead. The raid dies and the boss despawns with half a percentage health left. I felt like a literal monkey at that point. So Dragon Soul launches, and with it the system of transmogrification. One of the least liked raids, and one of the best liked systems, I'd say. Probably mostly due to the raid's long roleplay sessions, as well as some of the boss mechanics. Volleyball boss, I'm looking at you. Fuck you. Regardless, we rated it on both 10 man and 25 man once more. Though one thing that did come as a strange surprise was that I was swapped from doing 10 man with my rogue to doing 25 man with my rogue, and my warlock went to the 10 man group. This was mainly because of the next legendary that was implemented. Daggers which only a rogue could use. The first one went to someone from the guild, I can't remember the name. They were a part of the guild for a tier or two, but they disappeared before Dragon Soul was cleared. And I can't honestly remember them too well. So that meant we were left with a problem. Our only rogue had disappeared with the legendary daggers, and we had plenty more to go. So it was either through my suggestion, or I was asked that I swap to my rogue for 25 man to collect the materials, as you couldn't get them in 10 man. It wasn't like I was being carried though. I was at the top as per usual, but I'm sure people didn't take it nicely that I'm getting a second legendary in the expansion. I eventually did though, and I felt really lucky again. 2 legendaries in one expansion on 2 different characters. I'm sure there was some belly aching that I was never part of, but I was really conscious over it. And now I preluded to some new choices earlier, and I feel this is about the time frame I remember it happening. So what happened? I made a decision to change my ways, be healthier, and apply to a university which I ended up getting into. Now you may think that was good, and I agreed, it was a good decision. Yet if you knew the whole story, I'd imagine you would cringe and think I'm mentally challenged in some way. I was convinced that if I changed this one thing about myself, I would gain everything I needed. Friends, happiness, motivation for life, a job, maybe even the love of my life would somehow walk through the door. Everything would somehow be granted to me if I changed this one thing. You want to guess what that is? My physique. So I began exercising a lot. Throughout this, I'm quite an obnoxious health guru. I distinctively remember one time a guildie said they were getting a soda, and I snapped back at them saying, no, you need to drink water, or something similar. It was very cringe. So while playing WoW every day still, I'm working out and actually achieving results. It took me a year, but I managed it quite well. Sadly, I didn't do it the right way, and let's just say I wasn't my own best friend, and we will move on from that. Nothing else really happens in Dragon Soul. We clear it, got our title, and loot a few mounts, and then it's time to level up again in the next expansion. So that wraps up Cataclysm. Thinking about it now, the expansion was quite a rollercoaster for me, personally. At the start, I'm basically a sleepless zombie. At the halfway point, I'm in a really dark place, mentally. And at the end, I became a dysfunctional health guru with dreams of grandeur and 2 different legendaries. In terms of the expansion, the best part probably has to be Firelands and Transmog system, honestly. Everything else around it just, well, happened, for better or worse. It is a bit strange because you didn't really feel Deathwing's presence that much. Like sure, the elements are going nuts and the Twilight Hammer is being a bitch, and Nefarin's still kicking up a storm, yet Deathwing outside of lower range leveling didn't really play much of a part in the endgame outside of being a raid's end boss. If you didn't do the new leveling, you probably wouldn't even really know who Deathwing was at max level, to be honest. Well, that's how I feel in hindsight anyway. So, thank you for watching or listening to me ramble on about Cataclysm. Next up, Mists of Pandaria. Give the video a like or a dislike, either works, and subscribe for more ramble.